It was my third week in this quiet neighbourhood, and already it felt like I'd been here forever. I had moved into this small, cosy house, hoping to escape the noise of the city and find some peace. As a young professional, living alone had always been my choice, just me, my thoughts, and the hum of my own life. But something about this place, about this house, felt different. Something wasn't right. The neighbourhood seemed almost too perfect at first glance. Leafy trees lined the sidewalks, and the houses were well kept, all neatly tucked away from the chaos of the world. Yet, as I'd sit by the window, sipping my coffee in the mornings, I noticed one thing. There was a man, Mr. Raza, who lived next door. He didn't do anything out of the ordinary, not at first. He simply sat on his porch every evening, staring at my house. At first I thought maybe he was just someone who enjoyed the quiet as much as I did, but his gaze was different. It was lingering, almost as if he was studying every corner of my house. It made me uneasy, but I tried to ignore it. People stare sometimes, right? Nothing to worry about, I told myself. That is until one evening he came to my door. I had just finished a long day at work when I heard the knock. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, Mr. Raza stood there holding a plastic water bottle in his hand, his face twisted in a half smile. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "I've had a problem with my water supply. Would you mind if I fill up a few bottles? It's been a long day, and I'm sure you understand." I hesitated. It wasn't that I didn't want to help, but something about his tone made me pause. Why hadn't he asked any of the other neighbours? Why me? But, like a fool, I let my guard down. He was my neighbour, after all. "Sure, no problem," I said, stepping aside to let him in. As he passed, I caught a strange glint in his eyes, a kind of curiosity that seemed almost too deliberate, but I brushed it off as nothing. Mr. Raza made his way to the kitchen, filling his bottles with water as if he had done this 1,000 times before. I stood by, unsure of what to do, my gaze drifting over him. His movements were precise, almost calculated. He walked around the room, glancing at the walls, the windows, the locks. It was as though he were mentally measuring every inch of the space. "You've got a nice place here," he commented casually. "You've got some good security, right?" His eyes lingered on the front door, then on the back windows. I chuckled nervously. "Yeah, it's all pretty secure." But his comment didn't sit right with me. Why was he so interested in my security? When he finally left, I thought nothing of it at first. A neighbourly exchange, nothing more. But as I locked the door behind him, a feeling of discomfort settled deep in my stomach. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The house was quiet, too quiet, but then a shadow. I saw it move past the window, a figure. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat, and rushed to the window. Nothing, just the empty street bathed in moonlight. I couldn't explain it, but something about Mr. Raza's visit, something felt wrong. I tried to push it aside, telling myself I was just tired. But the feeling lingered, creeping over me like a shadow that refused to leave. I couldn't help but wonder, had I made a mistake letting him in? And why did I feel like I wasn't alone, even when I was? It started small, just little things that I could have easily brushed off, things that didn't seem to matter at first. But the more time passed, the more they added up, and the more my unease grew. One evening, after a long day at work, I came home and switched on the light in the hallway. I remember feeling that familiar sense of relief. Finally, home. But when I glanced toward the living room, I froze. The light in there was on. I was certain I hadn't turned it on when I left in the morning. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but it was the first time I noticed it so clearly. The light, as though it had a life of its own, flickering in the corner of my eye. I went to switch it off, telling myself I was just tired, but the knot in my stomach remained. The next morning I noticed something else. The door to the bathroom slightly ajar. I never left it that way. I was meticulous about little things like that. Still, I thought maybe I'd just been distracted. But then there was the chair, a simple wooden chair by the dining table. It had been shifted a few inches, not much, but just enough to make me wonder. A creeping thought clawed at my mind. What if I hadn't moved it? I tried to ignore it. Life had been chaotic lately, and maybe I was just overthinking things. Maybe I'd been too absorbed in my work, distracted by the pressure of daily life. But then, one evening, I walked into tea. A few nights passed before I finally worked up the courage to check the footage. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the hours, my mind running wild with 1,000 different possibilities. Maybe it was just a malfunction, maybe there was an explanation I hadn't thought of yet. But as I watched, I felt my stomach drop. There, in the dim light of the living room, was Mr. Raza. He was standing motionless in the middle of my room, staring at me as I slept on the couch. His eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, his body perfectly still. He hadn't come in through the door, he had opened the window, slid it up with the quiet precision of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. He had been in my house watching me sleep. I could hardly breathe. The world around me felt like it was collapsing. I wanted to scream, to do something, anything. But the fear paralyzed me. How had he done this? How long had he been doing this? I locked the doors and windows, triple-checked everything. My heart pounded as my eyes darted from one corner of the room to the next. I couldn't escape the feeling that Mr. Raza was still here, still watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. In a panic, I grabbed the phone, but I hesitated. Who would believe me? Would they think I was crazy? The footage was shocking, but it still seemed unbelievable. Would the police think I was just making up stories? I didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear. I couldn't stay here. Not like this. Not with him so close, his presence a shadow that clung to me, always lurking, always just out of sight. My mind raced. The footage had shown me everything I needed to know. Mr. Raza wasn't just some odd neighbour, he was a threat. A cold, calculated presence who had invaded my space, my sanctuary, and now I could feel him closing in again. I couldn't just wait any longer. I needed to act. The fear had twisted itself into a knot of anger and desperation. I told myself I wasn't going to hide this time. I wouldn't be the victim cowering in the shadows. I had to take control. I couldn't keep pretending like everything was normal, like I hadn't seen the footage that made my blood run cold. I was done being silent, done with being too afraid to confront what I already knew. That night, I set a trap. I deliberately left the living room light on, like I always did, but I made sure to leave the windows slightly ajar. I could hear the wind outside rustling the trees, but it wasn't the breeze that made my skin crawl. It was the silence that followed, the silence before the storm. I waited for hours, every muscle in my body wound tight, every nerve screaming that something was about to happen. I couldn't sit still anymore. Then, around midnight, it came. A faint creak echoed through the house, a sound so subtle, so quiet, yet it hit me like a punch to the chest. It was the same noise I'd heard the night Mr. Raza had been standing in the living room watching me sleep. My breath caught in my throat, and I forced myself to move. No more hiding, no more waiting. I grabbed my phone and my kitchen knife, the blade cold in my grip. The weight of it gave me a false sense of courage, the sharp edge a reminder that I wasn't powerless. My feet were silent as I crept toward the living room, every step measured, every heartbeat louder than the last. As I reached the doorway, my breath caught in my throat. There he was, Mr. Raza, standing by the bookshelf, his back to me. His presence was suffocating, his figure like a shadow in the corner of the room. He wasn't even trying to hide anymore. He was bold, he was confident. I stepped forward, my voice shaking but determined. "What do you want from me? Why are you doing this?" He turned slowly, his eyes glinting in the dim light. A slow, almost mocking smile spread across his face. "You invited me in, remember?" His voice was low, calm, as if this was all some game to him. I froze. His words hit harder than any punch because they were true. I had let him in. I had made the mistake of thinking he was just a harmless neighbour, someone in need of a favour. But now it was too late. There was no more pretending. "Get out!" I demanded, stepping forward, my knife trembling in my grip. "Leave my house, now!" His smirk only grew wider, and for a moment I thought he was going to laugh. "You really think you can stop me?" he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "You think I'm afraid of you?" The air between us crackled with tension, thick and suffocating. I couldn't back down. I couldn't let him control me any longer. I lunged, adrenaline surging through me, pushing me forward. The knife cut the air, and in the chaos of the struggle, we collided. Furniture was sent crashing to the floor, the room spinning around me. Mr. Raza staggered back, his foot catching on the edge of the coffee table. For a moment I thought he was going to regain his balance, but then he tripped, falling hard against the bookshelf. His head collided with the corner, and a sickening crack echoed through the room. I stood there, heart hammering in my chest, staring at him, motionless, blood slowly pooling around his head. I didn't know if he was dead or unconscious, but I couldn't stay to find out. Panic hit me like a wave, and before I could second-guess myself, I turned and bolted for the door, my legs moving faster than my thoughts. Screaming for help, I ran out into the street, my voice hoarse, my mind spinning. I had escaped, this time. But as I glanced back toward the house, my eyes darted toward the darkened window. I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped at all, that somewhere, somehow, Mr. Raza would find a way back in. I didn't know how long I stood there staring at the empty doorway, my lungs fighting for air, my mind in chaos. The world felt like it was shifting beneath my feet, the ground unsteady, as if everything I thought I knew had been torn apart in the span of one horrifying night. I had thought that when I finally ran from Mr. Raza, when I screamed for help and stumbled into the cold, empty street, that it would be over, that I would be free. But I was wrong. The police arrived quickly. They were kind but distant, asking all the right questions with their practiced professionalism. Yet, in the back of my mind, a voice screamed that they didn't understand. How could they? How could anyone understand what I had just lived through? They looked at the scene, no signs of forced entry, no immediate evidence beyond the footage I showed them, and shrugged. To them, it wasn't enough. They didn't have the proof to pursue anything more. They left soon after, promising they'd keep an eye out, but I knew better. They wouldn't be back, not unless something else happened. I wanted to believe that the nightmare was over, that it had ended when Mr. Raza fell to the ground, his body still and silent. But as the hours turned into days, a chilling feeling began to settle deep in my chest. There was more to this than I'd realized, more than I had even begun to understand. It was when I was cleaning up the remnants of the struggle, trying to put some semblance of normalcy back into my life, that I found it. The attic door hidden behind a forgotten bookshelf. It had always been there, but I had never noticed it before. The wood was old, worn, but it creaked loudly as I opened it, as if it had been waiting to be discovered. Climbing the narrow stairs, I felt a cold draft against my skin, my breath visible in the dusty air. The attic was dim, the shadows so thick it felt like they were pressing in on me. It smelled like mildew, like time had stood still up there. But as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, something caught my attention. Something that shouldn't have been there. Old yellowed photographs scattered across the floor, some pinned to the walls. I picked up the first one, my fingers trembling as I stared at it. It was a picture of my house taken from across the street, and in the corner, just barely visible in the frame, was Mr. Raza, standing there, watching. The photo had been taken weeks before we'd ever even met. I felt my stomach twist. The room spun around me, the air suddenly thick with the weight of the truth crashing down. This wasn't random. This wasn't a coincidence. Mr. Raza hadn't just shown up on my doorstep. He had been watching me long before that, long before I even knew he existed. The photos kept coming, dozens of them, some showing my backyard, some from inside the house through the windows, all taken from across the street, all from angles that only someone with time and patience could have captured. The walls of that attic were lined with memories I never asked for, moments of my life that had been quietly stolen, one photograph at a time. And then, in the far corner of the attic, I found something even worse. A small, neatly folded letter. It was old, the paper yellowed, the handwriting sharp and deliberate. I read it aloud, my voice barely a whisper. "You're mine now. I've been watching you, waiting for the right moment. You won't escape. I'll be back when you least expect it." The words burned into my brain like fire, and I dropped the letter, backing away as if the very act of touching it had poisoned me. The world felt unreal, twisted into something grotesque. This had been his plan all along, to break me, to twist my perception of reality until I didn't know what was real anymore. And he had succeeded. Days later, as I tried to regain some semblance of normalcy, I thought the worst was behind me. That was when it happened. A letter slipped under my door. The envelope was plain, the paper thick, the handwriting familiar. My blood turned cold as I opened it. "I'll be back when you least expect it." The words stared back at me like a death sentence, and I realized with a sickening certainty that my nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun.